I'd like you to comment a bit about the Dominican chapel and the space designed by Demas Oyoko and how that has functioned for the Dominican since it was built in the 70s.
Okay. Um, First of all, the chapel architectural design was done after the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council was from 1962 to 1965. And the Second Vatican Council, you could describe it as the most important event in Christianity in the 20th century, in the sense that it brought about a renewed awareness of what the church is. Part of that renewed awareness of what the church is the idea of the church as people of God, not to de-emphasize the hierarchy, but to see the church as both a hierarchical, and as well as the people of God. Now, that is already reflected in the design. You would have seen that, unlike most churches that are rectangular in shape, where you have the priests way up front and the people are all at the back, you now have a kind of semicircular shape, such that the priests and the worshippers they are all more or less on the same level. It's the people of God worshiping together, with the priest in the middle instead of the priest in front. So the motif is kind of influenced by a renewed understanding of the church, the Second Vatican Council. Let me emphasize renewed, because it wasn't a new understanding. If you go back to the history of Christianity, it's what you find in the writings of early Christians, the first 800 years of Christianity. The second motif is African. If you go into that chapel, you would observe the various artifacts, shapes, and so on and so forth. The crucifix, for example, depicts an African on the cross. And that tells a lot about the history of Africa. You can say the African is crucified by slave trade, crucified by colonialism, and today crucified by bad governance on the part of indigenous African leaders. You look at the pond, you see a pond before you enter the church. It goes back to the idea of baptism in the early church being the entrance. Baptism is the entrance into the church. You are baptized and you enter the church. The same way you pass by that font, you enter the church. You see the pillars, and depicted in the pillars are the female breasts, a sign of fertility. The church that is fertile in bringing forth children for God through the waters of baptism, bringing forth children and nourishing them around the table of the Eucharist. That, in a nutshell, is what you find put together there. Another thing I should point out is, if you look at the chapel, you see it's uncompleted, and that is deliberate. It's deliberate in the sense that the church herself is still being renewed. That's a theological motive. The church is always subject to renewal until the parousia, the second coming of Christ. That's why if you go around, you see it's deliberately left uncompleted.
What about the furniture and the space planning?
Very
How
good.
has that functioned for the Dominican since it was built in the 70s?
One thing that I observed the first time I entered that chapel is the acoustics. The way the floor is done, the way the ceiling is done, you didn't need to spend any money that you would spend today on acoustics if you had to build a church. For a long time, we used that chapel without any public address system. the wooden floor polished, the seats polished, everything. All that aided the transmission of sound. But of course, now there are more people using it, and there are people outside on Sundays. So we've had to begin to use a public address system. In terms of space, I think we're having problems now with more people using it. That chapel is built for give and take 200. Now you have more than that. The population of Christians in Nigeria has increased tremendously, and certainly in this neighborhood. And many more people are showing interest in coming to worship there. I think today, if a chapel like that were to be built, there certainly will be some modification. Today, what you find is very little room even for the concelebrating priests. If you go around Nigeria, you find that some other groups have tried to replicate that design, and you can see also their efforts at correcting what is lacking. Like any work of art, it's an unfinished project. Unfinished project meaning there's always something to add to it. There's always something you can do to make it more beautiful.
So would you consider Demas Nwoko a visionary for introducing the arts in maybe sanctuary design in Nigeria?
Certainly.
As you're commenting that people have replicated
Certainly.
it. And
Certainly.
if you can give us examples of the churches that might have replicated these examples.
Certainly. Before I give examples, talking of the African motif, one of the things that came out of the Second Vatican Council is the idea of inculturation, Africanization of Christianity, expressing Christianity in categories of African culture and African thought patterns. And you see that in what Demas Nwoko has done. It's an attempt to depict a church in Africa, quite different from a church in the Western world. And even in the Western world today, the churches you build in the Western world today are not of the same architectural design as what you had in the Middle Ages, the Gothic architecture and all that. There are two places where I find that very well replicated in Nigeria: Holy Cross Cathedral in Lagos and Christ Church Cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral in Lagos. Now, in terms of other places trying to do the same thing, I can count the Chapel of the Benedictine Monastery in Ewu, Edo State, the Chapel of the SMA Formation Community in Bodija, Ibadan, the huge St. Leo's Catholic Church in Ikeja, there's another place I think is an attempt to replicate that. If you look at the cathedral, the Pro Cathedral in Abuja, Our Lady Queen of Peace, it's an attempt to replicate that, but on a larger scale. Increasingly, you find people designing churches using the secular or semi-secular shape, so that both worshippers and priests are more or less together. Even before Demas Nwoko, as I said before we began this interview, the second oldest Catholic church in Lagos, St. Paul's Ibutimeta, where I was baptized and brought up, you had these African motifs. I used to admire the statue of St. Joseph there, dressed in Agbada, and Mary standing beside him, dressed like a Yoruba woman, the various stations of the cross, the different characters in the Passion story dressed as Africans. All this came out of the awareness, the renewed awareness at the Second Vatican Council that the church is not just European. The church is larger than Europe. The church is larger than Western culture. It is a church that is open to all cultures. And you don't have to be European in order to become Christian. Pope Paul VI made a statement in 1969, 4 years after the council ended, made a statement in Kampala, Uganda, in which he said to Africans, you must have an African Christianity. So this is one major effort to implement that project of an African Christianity.
Thank you very much, Father.
Welcome.